When most people think of the worst serial killers in history, names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy immediately come to mind. These monsters dominated headlines, inspired countless documentaries, and became household names synonymous with evil. But what if I told you that some of the most prolific and terrifying killers in American history remain virtually unknown to the public? What if the most dangerous predators were the ones who never achieved fame, never became the subject of Netflix series, and never had their stories told in primetime specials? Today, we're diving into the shadows to uncover 5 serial killers whose body counts rival or exceed those famous names, yet they've somehow slipped through the cracks of public consciousness. These aren't your typical true crime celebrities. These are the forgotten monsters, the ones who killed with such efficiency and brutality that even seasoned investigators struggle to comprehend their methods. We're talking about killers who claimed dozens of victims, operated across multiple states, and in some cases were never even caught. The first name on our list might shock you with its sheer scale of destruction. Carl Eugene Watts, known as the Sunday Morning Slasher, is suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in United States history. While Ted Bundy confessed to 30 murders and Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 victims, Watts may have murdered over 100 people, yet his name remains buried in case files, unknown to the very public that should fear his legacy. Then there's the new Bedford highway killer, a phantom who terrorized Massachusetts in the late 1980s, leaving 9 bodies along desolate highways and 2 victims who were never found. This case represents one of America's most perplexing, unsolved serial murder investigations, with the killer's identity remaining a mystery despite extensive investigations spanning over 3 decades. We'll also explore Paul John Knowles, the so-called Casanova killer, whose good looks and charm masked a ruthless nature that left at least 18 people dead across multiple states. Unlike other killers who tried to avoid detection, Knowles seemed to court attention while simultaneously evading capture, driven by an insatiable need for fame and recognition. Our journey takes us back to the early 1900s with the Atlanta Ripper, who terrorized Atlanta's African American community between 1909 and 1914, claiming at least 15 victims. This case represents one of America's earliest documented serial killing sprees, occurring during a period of intense racial tension when victims received minimal police attention. Finally, we'll examine David Carpenter, the trailside killer whose crimes in the beautiful hiking trails of Northern California shattered the sense of safety in nature itself. His methodical approach to hunting victims in remote locations created a reign of terror that lasted years. These aren't just forgotten footnotes in criminal history. These are cases that reveal the darkest aspects of human nature, the failures of law enforcement systems, and the terrifying reality that some monsters operate in plain sight while others vanish into the shadows, leaving behind only questions and grief. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7th, 1953, in a small town that would never imagine it had produced one of America's most dangerous predators. His early life seemed relatively normal, raised by his mother, Dorothy Mae Young, after his father left the family when Carl was less than 2 years old. But at age 8, everything changed. Watts contracted meningitis, a life-threatening infection that required hospitalization and intensive treatment. His body temperature soared so high that doctors feared permanent brain damage. The medical trauma was severe, involving painful spinal taps and isolation from other patients at Herman Kiefer Hospital in Detroit. Family members noticed an immediate and disturbing change in his personality following his recovery. The once normal child became withdrawn, bashful, and increasingly antisocial. More troubling were his bizarre statements about women having evil eyes and evil spirits. This medical crisis appears to have been the catalyst that transformed a regular boy into someone with deeply disturbed thoughts about the opposite sex. By his teenage years, Watts was already displaying violent tendencies toward women. At 15, he attacked a woman on his paper route, marking the beginning of a pattern that would escalate into unimaginable horror. He was suspected in multiple attacks and murders throughout his teens and early 20s. But law enforcement could never gather enough evidence to make charges stick. This inability to build solid cases would become a recurring theme that allowed Watts to continue his killing spree undetected for years. What made Watts particularly dangerous was his complete unpredictability. Unlike other serial killers who followed specific patterns or targeted particular types of victims, Watts seemed to kill at random. His methods varied wildly, from stabbing and strangulation to drowning and bludgeoning. He didn't rape his victims, he didn't rob them, and he didn't appear to gain any sexual satisfaction from the murders. When police eventually caught him, his explanation was as chilling as it was bizarre. He claimed he chose his victims because they had evil eyes, and he wanted to rid the world of their evil spirits. This apparent randomness made Watts nearly impossible to track. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were dealing with murders that seemed unconnected, committed by different methods with no apparent motive or pattern. What they didn't realize was that all these seemingly random killings were the work of one man driven by a twisted internal logic that only he understood. Dr. Harley Stock, a forensic psychologist who evaluated over 800 criminals convicted of murder and sex crimes, became involved in the investigation of what was then called the Sunday morning slasher case. Stock believes that despite the apparent randomness, Watts did have a specific fantasy in mind when selecting victims. Though he didn't rape them, Stock theorizes the attacks were sexually motivated in a psychological sense. Watts would develop a mental image of his ideal victim, then go out and hunt for someone who matched that fantasy. The victims weren't actually chosen at random. Though Watts killed 2 black women and 1 Hispanic woman, his targets were almost exclusively attractive young white women, often with long hair. They represented something specific in his damaged psyche, perhaps women he desired but could never have, or women who reminded him of some deep-seated trauma or rejection. In 1981, Watts relocated to Columbus, Texas, where he found work with an oil company. But his real job was hunting. He would spend his weekends driving over 70 miles to Houston, where he found the perfect hunting ground for a serial killer. Houston was experiencing a crime epidemic, with over 700 homicides that year, making it the murder capital of the United States. Police were overwhelmed, understaffed, and underpaid. In this chaos, Watts could kill with impunity, knowing that his crimes would likely be lost in the shuffle of urban violence. The Houston killing spree was methodical and brutal. Watts would later confess to stalking and murdering 12 Texas women during this period. Linda Tilley was drowned in her own bathtub. Elizabeth Montgomery was stabbed to death, and just 2 hours later, Susan Wolfe met the same fate. Ellen Tam was found hanged, while Margaret Fossey was asphyxiated. Elena Samander was strangled, and her body dumped in a trash dumpster like garbage. Among his victims was 14-year-old Emily Lacroix, just a child when Watts decided she had evil eyes. Anna Ledette was a promising medical student whose life was cut short by Watts' twisted mission. The randomness of his methods and the lack of connection between victims meant that police had no idea they were dealing with a serial killer. Each murder seemed like an isolated incident, committed by different perpetrators for different reasons. Watts was killing at will, leaving no evidence, no witnesses, and no patterns for investigators to follow. His capture came about through sheer luck and the incredible bravery of one of his intended victims. On May 23, 1982, Watts broke into an apartment complex in Houston, planning to kill two women, Melinda Aguilar and Lori Lister. He attacked Aguilar first, choking her until she lost consciousness, then tied her hands behind her back. What Watts didn't know was that Aguilar was only pretending to be unconscious, desperately trying to figure out how to escape. As Watts went to get Lister, planning to drown both women in the bathtub, Aguilar made a desperate decision. With her hands tied behind her back, she threw herself off the first-floor balcony, landing hard but managing to attract attention. Her screams brought help, and police arrived just in time to save Lister and arrest Watts. This single act of courage not only saved two lives, but also led to the capture of what may be America's most prolific serial killer. The legal proceedings that followed would become one of the most controversial plea bargains in American criminal justice history. Prosecutors, desperate to solve multiple cold cases and lacking solid evidence for most of the murders, made a deal with Watts. In exchange for his cooperation and detailed confessions to 13 murders, they agreed to a 60-year prison sentence instead of the death penalty. The authorities believed this would keep Watts behind bars for life, while finally bringing closure to grieving families. But the deal contained a fatal flaw. Due to Texas sentencing laws at the time, Watts would become eligible for parole much sooner than anyone anticipated. By 2004, the horrifying realization set in that Watts might actually be released from prison. The man who had confessed to killing over a dozen people, who had told investigators he would kill again if released, was potentially going to walk free. The prospect of Watts's release sparked a desperate legal battle. Michigan authorities, realizing that Watts's Texas plea deal didn't grant him immunity in their state, launched a frantic search for evidence to charge him with murder in Michigan. They made public pleas for anyone with information to come forward, hoping to find something, anything, that would keep this monster locked away. Their efforts paid off when a witness came forward claiming to have seen someone matching Watts's description fatally stab a woman in Michigan in 1979. This new evidence allowed prosecutors to charge Watts with murder in Michigan, where he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The chilling reality of Watts's mindset was revealed during his confessions to Houston detective Tom Ladd. As they drove to locations where Watts had buried victims, the detective asked if he was glad the killing spree was over, if he felt relief at getting it off his conscience. Watts's response was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. He told Ladd that if he ever got out of prison, he would kill again. There was no remorse, no recognition of the pain he had caused, just a matter-of-fact statement about his intentions to continue murdering innocent people. Carl Eugene Watts has died of prostate cancer in a Michigan prison on September 21st, 2007. His death brought relief to investigators, victims' families, and the general public who had lived with the knowledge that such a dangerous predator existed. But his legacy raises disturbing questions about how many other killers like him are operating undetected, how many victims remain uncounted, and how a man could murder over 100 people while remaining virtually unknown to the public. Now let's dive into the story of the New Bedford highway killer, a case that remains one of America's most chilling, unsolved serial murder mysteries. Between March 1988 and April 1989, an unknown predator stalked the streets of New Bedford, Massachusetts, claiming the lives of at least 9 women and leaving 2 more missing without a trace. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the fact that over 3 decades later, the killer's identity remains completely unknown. The victims shared a tragic commonality that made them perfect targets for a calculating predator. These were women in their 20s and 30s who lived on the margins of society, struggling with drug addiction and often working as prostitutes to survive. They represented the hidden side of historic New Bedford that tourists never saw, the street life of a city plagued in the 1980s by heroin and cocaine addiction, and far too often violence. But these weren't just statistics or nameless victims. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends who mattered to someone. Each had their own personality, their own dreams, their own struggles, and their own good qualities that made them human beings worthy of justice. The killer understood exactly what he was doing when he targeted this vulnerable population. These women were easy prey, not just because of their circumstances, but because he knew they were less likely to be immediately missed when they disappeared. He calculated that their cases might receive less intensive investigation, and tragically, he was largely correct. The systematic nature of his victim selection reveals a predator who was both intelligent and utterly ruthless in his planning. The first body was discovered in July 1988 along Route 140 in New Bedford, but the victim, Deborah Medeiros, had actually been missing since May. The 29-year-old Fall River woman was found in a state of severe decomposition, positioned on her back with her feet pointing toward the highway. She had been strangled with a bra wrapped around her neck. This positioning would become a signature element that connected the killer's crimes, suggesting a ritualistic aspect to his murders that went beyond simple killing. Just weeks later, another body was found. Nancy Lee Paiva, 36, had last been seen walking home from Whispers Pub after a fight with her boyfriend in the early morning hours of July 7th, 1988. Her nude body was discovered beside Interstate 195 in Dartmouth, positioned in exactly the same manner as Deborah Medeiros, on her back with her feet pointing toward the highway. The cause of death was again strangulation. The deliberate positioning of the bodies wasn't random or coincidental. It was a calling card, a signature that would help investigators eventually link multiple crime scenes to a single killer. What made this case so frustrating for law enforcement was the killer's apparent sophistication and intimate knowledge of the local area. He demonstrated an understanding of the highway system that allowed him to choose disposal sites where bodies wouldn't be immediately discovered, giving him time to escape and plan his next move. The remote locations he selected were perfect for his purposes, isolated enough that he could work undisturbed, but accessible enough that the bodies would eventually be found. One of the most tragic aspects of the investigation was how slowly authorities recognized they were dealing with a serial killer. In the beginning, each disappearance and each murder was treated as an isolated incident. It wasn't until the pattern became undeniable that investigators realized they were hunting a single predator who was systematically targeting women from the same community. This delay in recognition gave the killer precious time to continue his spree while law enforcement played catch-up. Former New Bedford police detective Richard Ferreira and his partner were among the first to connect the dots. When they investigated Nancy Paiva's murder, they quickly realized they weren't dealing with isolated incidents. As Ferreira later recalled, they came to the chilling conclusion that they had a serial killer operating in their city. But by then, the killer had already claimed multiple victims and had refined his methods to an alarming degree of efficiency. The killer's hunting ground extended beyond New Bedford itself. Bodies were found scattered across the highways and back roads of southeastern Massachusetts, from New Bedford to Dartmouth to Westport. This geographic spread suggested someone who was either very familiar with the area or someone who spent considerable time driving these routes, possibly as part of their occupation. The killer's knowledge of secluded areas where bodies could be dumped without immediate discovery pointed to someone who had extensively scouted locations or who had legitimate reasons to be familiar with remote areas throughout the region. By the spring of 1989, 9 bodies had been recovered, but 2 women remained missing, their fates unknown but almost certainly tragic. The families of these missing women faced a particular kind of torment, never knowing for certain what had happened to their loved ones, never having closure, never being able to properly mourn and move forward. As one investigator later noted, this was one of the hardest aspects of the case, the families of the 2 women whose remains were never found. One of the most intriguing developments in the case came years later through social media. Wayne Perry, who had created a Facebook page devoted to the case, was contacted by a man with a potentially crucial piece of information. The man claimed that in the summer of 1988, he had passed a van pulled over on Route 88 near Horseneck Beach in Westport. He witnessed what appeared to be 2 men struggling to dispose of a large wrapped object that looked like a body. The location was significant because it was the same general area where victim Mary Rose Santos was later found in 1989. What made this tip even more compelling was that when Wayne showed the witness pictures of various suspects, the man consistently picked out the same face twice. The witness later died in a house fire before the information could be fully investigated, representing a tragic lost opportunity that might have broken the case wide open. The fact that this potential breakthrough was never properly pursued by authorities highlights some of the investigative shortcomings that may have allowed the killer to escape justice. The investigation was further complicated by false leads and wrongful accusations that diverted valuable resources and attention. Kenneth Ponte, a New Bedford lawyer, became the only person ever arrested in connection with the case. He was eventually indicted for the murder of victim Rochelle Clifford Dopierala, but the charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence. Ponte died before the case was resolved, taking whatever secrets he might have had with him to the grave. Another suspect, Tony DeGrazia, was found dead under suspicious circumstances just 1 month after being released from custody. His body was discovered at his ex-girlfriend's parents' home, lying face down under a picnic table in their backyard. While Freetown police initially ruled his death a homicide based on the autopsy findings, the district attorney's office later changed the ruling to suicide, a decision that the autopsy evidence didn't support. DeGrazia's death came immediately after Kenneth Ponte was released as the prime suspect, and authorities suggested that DeGrazia took his own life after learning he was now the #1 suspect. However, the circumstances surrounding his death raised more questions than they answered. The case took on international dimensions when connections were drawn to similar murders in Europe. Between 1992 and 1993, 3 sex workers were murdered and disemboweled in Lisbon, Portugal, by an unknown killer dubbed the Lisbon Ripper. The similarities to the New Bedford case were striking enough that Portuguese police sent 2 detectives to Massachusetts to gather information, while FBI agents traveled to Lisbon to investigate potential connections. The theory emerged that the same individual might be responsible for crimes on both sides of the Atlantic. The international connection became even more complex when the Lisbon murders were linked to similar killings in Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the Czech Republic between 1993 and 1997. The working theory was that the killer had become a long-haul truck driver, using his occupation to move between countries and continue his deadly work. New Bedford's sizable Portuguese community and the fact that many of the highway killer's victims were of Portuguese ancestry added another layer to the international investigation. This international angle raised disturbing questions about the true scope of the killer's activities. If the same person was responsible for murders across multiple countries, the actual victim count could be far higher than the 11 women connected to the New Bedford case. The mobility that would come with being a truck driver would provide the perfect cover for a serial killer, allowing him to strike in different locations while maintaining the anonymity that comes with constantly being on the move. Despite decades of investigation, the New Bedford highway killer case remains officially unsolved. The State Police Cold Case Unit continues to follow leads and tips from the public, but the passage of time has made the investigation increasingly challenging. Without the DNA technology available today, investigators in the late 1980s were unable to collect and analyze the kind of forensic evidence that might have identified the killer. The decomposed state of many of the bodies and the outdoor crime scenes exposed to the elements for weeks or months further complicated evidence collection. The case serves as a stark reminder of how serial killers can exploit society's blind spots to continue their crimes. By targeting vulnerable women who existed on the margins of society, the New Bedford highway killer was able to operate for over a year before law enforcement fully recognized the scope of the threat. The victims' involvement with drugs and prostitution, while making them vulnerable to predators, also meant that their disappearances weren't immediately treated with the urgency that might have led to earlier intervention. Today, the families of the victims continue to seek answers and justice. The passage of over 30 years hasn't diminished their need for closure or their hope that someday the killer will be identified and held accountable for his crimes. The investigators who worked the case, both those who have retired and those still active in law enforcement, remain committed to finding answers. As one investigator noted, people cannot get away with murder, and the determination to bring justice to the victims drives continued efforts to solve the case. The New Bedford highway killer represents one of the most frustrating examples of a serial killer who managed to evade capture despite leaving behind multiple crime scenes and victims. Unlike some serial killers who are eventually caught through their own mistakes or escalating behavior, this killer appears to have simply stopped, either through death, imprisonment for other crimes, or by moving his activities to another location. Continuing our exploration of these forgotten monsters, we turn to a case that remains one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. The Atlanta Ripper terrorized the city from 1909 to 1914, and what makes this case particularly disturbing is how it represents one of the earliest documented serial killing sprees in American history, occurring during a period when racial tensions were at their peak and African American victims received virtually no attention from law enforcement or the media. The Atlanta of the early 20th century was a powder keg of racial hatred. Just 3 years before the first murder, the city had been torn apart by race riots that left at least 25 African Americans dead at the hands of white mobs. The New South movement was desperately trying to rebrand the region as progressive and investment worthy. But beneath this veneer of tolerance, Jim Crow laws still ruled, black voters were systematically disenfranchised, and crimes against African American victims were treated as secondary concerns at best. It was into this toxic atmosphere that the Atlanta Ripper emerged, targeting a very specific type of victim. By the end of 1911, 15 women had been murdered in the same horrific manner. All were black or mixed race, all were in their early 20s, and all were described by newspapers as good-looking, neatly dressed, and educated. These weren't random street women or prostitutes like Jack the Ripper's victims in London. These were working-class women with jobs, many employed as domestic servants in white households. They were financially comfortable by the standards of their community, and they had received educations that set them apart. The killer's methodology was as brutal as it was consistent. Each victim was found with their throat slashed from ear to ear, the cuts so deep they nearly decapitated the women. But the horror didn't end with death. The murderer would rip, tear, and mutilate the bodies after killing them, displaying a level of rage and sadism that shocked even hardened investigators. The attacks seemed to happen without warning, often as the women were walking home from work in the evening or late at night. The geographical pattern revealed intimate knowledge of Atlanta's African American neighborhoods. Many of the killings took place in the city's Old Fourth Ward, an area with limited street lighting and poor public transportation. The lack of streetcars and the cover of darkness provided the killer with perfect conditions to select and attack his victims. Bodies were often discovered near railroad tracks, suggesting the killer used the rail lines as both hunting grounds and disposal routes. The first documented murder that established the pattern began this reign of terror on May 28, 1911. Belle Walker, a cook, was found 25 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street by her sister after she failed to return from work the previous night. 4 weeks later, another victim, Addie Watts, was discovered with her throat slashed in the same manner. As news of the murders spread, terror gripped Atlanta's African American community. By July 3rd, after the eighth consecutive killing, the Baltimore Sun reported that the murders had caused few black women to venture onto the streets at night, and black service workers were refusing to go to work after dark. The community was essentially under siege, trapped in their homes by fear while the killer continued his rampage. One of the most brutal examples of the Ripper's work was the murder of 40-year-old Lena Sharp on July 1st, 1911. Her death was described as having her head almost completely severed from her body. This killing resulted in the first eyewitness account in the case, though the witness was too terrified to provide useful details to investigators. The witness reported seeing a figure fleeing the scene, but could offer no description beyond noting that the person moved quickly and seemed to know the area well. What made the Atlanta Ripper particularly terrifying was the complete randomness of his attacks combined with his obvious familiarity with his hunting grounds. Unlike organized killers who follow specific patterns or target victims with particular vulnerabilities, the Ripper seemed to strike whenever opportunity presented itself. A domestic worker walking home from her employer's house could become a victim simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigation was hampered from the beginning by the racial attitudes of the era. The Atlanta press gave minimal attention to the murders in the early days, treating them as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial killer. The police department, understaffed and overwhelmed with other crimes, devoted few resources to investigating the deaths of black women. The year 1906 had seen devastating race riots in the city, and the last thing civic leaders wanted was more negative attention that might scare away Northern investment. Some crime scenes contained notes signed Jack the Ripper with various threats, suggesting the killer was aware of the London murders and deliberately imitating or referencing them. This connection to the infamous Whitechapel murders added an extra layer of terror to an already frightened community. The idea that Atlanta had its own version of Jack the Ripper was almost too horrifying to contemplate. The social dynamics of the time meant that many of the victims' stories were never fully told. These were women with families, friends, hopes, and dreams, but they were reduced to brief newspaper mentions that focused more on the gruesome details of their deaths than on their lives. They worked in white households, often caring for children or maintaining homes, yet when they were murdered, their deaths were treated as footnotes rather than tragedies deserving full investigation. The killer's intimate knowledge of Atlanta's African American neighborhoods suggests he was either a resident of these areas or someone whose work brought him there regularly. He knew which streets were poorly lit, which routes women took walking home from work, and where bodies could be left without immediate discovery. This familiarity with the community made him even more dangerous because he could blend in, appearing as just another face in the neighborhood while planning his next attack. Despite the terror he caused and the clear pattern of his crimes, the Atlanta Ripper was never caught. The murders eventually stopped, leading investigators to speculate that he had either died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or moved to another city. The case files, such as they were, eventually gathered dust in police archives, and the victims were largely forgotten by history. The Atlanta Ripper case represents more than just unsolved murders. It's a window into the systemic racism and social neglect that allowed a serial killer to operate with virtual impunity for years. These women died not just at the hands of a murderer, but as victims of a society that deemed their lives less worthy of protection and their deaths less deserving of justice. The killer may have wielded the knife, but the system that failed to adequately investigate his crimes shares responsibility for the terror he inflicted on Atlanta's African American community. Today, over a century later, the Atlanta Ripper remains a shadow figure in criminal history. His true identity died with him, but his legacy lives on as a reminder of how social prejudice can shield even the most dangerous predators. The 15 confirmed victims, and possibly more women who died at his hands, deserved better than they received in life and in death. The Atlanta Ripper case represents one of America's most chilling and overlooked serial murder investigations from the early 1900s. Between 1909 and 1914, this unidentified killer terrorized Atlanta's African American community, claiming at least 15 lives in a reign of terror that would make Jack the Ripper himself seem tame by comparison. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the deliberate targeting of victims and the complete lack of justice that followed. The Atlanta Ripper didn't choose his victims randomly. He had a specific type in mind, and his selection process reveals the calculated nature of his predatory behavior. The killer's victims shared disturbing similarities that paint a picture of methodical selection. Many had received an education and were financially comfortable by the standards of their community. These weren't random street crimes or opportunistic killings. The Atlanta Ripper was hunting specific types of women, and his choices reflected both his twisted preferences and the social dynamics of early 20th century Atlanta. The geographical pattern of the murders reveals intimate knowledge of Atlanta's African American neighborhoods. Many of the killings took place in the city's Old Fourth Ward, an area with limited lighting and poor transportation access. The lack of streetcars and inadequate illumination provided the killer with perfect cover as he selected his victims under the cloak of darkness. Many victims were domestic servants who worked in white employers' homes, traveling through these dimly lit areas as they returned from work. The killer's methodology was as brutal as it was consistent. Each victim was murdered with a knife or sharp object, but the Atlanta Ripper didn't stop at killing. He would rip, tear, and mutilate the bodies after death, displaying a level of sadistic violence that went far beyond murder. The crime scenes were described as having an almost ritualistic quality, with the killer taking time to arrange his victims in specific ways. One particularly disturbing aspect of the case was the discovery of notes at some murder scenes, signed Jack the Ripper and containing various threats. Whether these were authentic communications from the killer or the work of someone seeking to capitalize on the terror is unknown, but they added an extra layer of psychological horror to an already traumatized community. The first documented murder that established the killer's pattern began on May 28, 1911, when Belle Walker, a cook, was found with her throat slashed just yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. Her sister discovered the body after Belle failed to return from work. 4 weeks later, another victim, Addie Watts, was found with the same gruesome wound pattern. As news of the murders spread, panic gripped Atlanta's black community. The terror was so intense that by July 1911, after 8 consecutive killings, newspapers reported that black women refused to walk the streets after dark, and domestic workers were declining to work evening hours. The fear was palpable and justified. This wasn't just a string of random violence, it was systematic hunting of vulnerable women. One of the most brutal examples of the Atlanta Ripper's work involved 40-year-old Lena Sharp, whose death on July 1st, 1911, was described as having her head nearly severed from her body. This murder was significant because it produced the first eyewitness account in the killing spree, though the witness information has been lost to history. The investigation was severely hampered by the racial attitudes of the era. Atlanta in the early 20th century maintained Jim Crow laws, disenfranchised black voters through poll taxes, and gave minimal attention to police investigations involving black victims. The city was still reeling from the infamous 1906 race riots, where at least 25 and possibly as many as 40 African American men were killed by white mobs following false accusations of sexual assault. This context of systemic racism meant that the Atlanta Ripper's crimes received far less attention and resources than they deserved. The Atlanta press initially gave little coverage to the murders, and when they did report on them, the victims were often dismissed or minimized. The city's leaders, focused on promoting the New South movement and attracting Northern investment, saw these murders as a public relations problem rather than a human tragedy requiring justice. The investigation's inadequacy is reflected in the complete lack of resolution. Despite 15 confirmed victims, and possibly more, no suspect was ever seriously pursued, no arrests were made, and no one was ever held accountable for this systematic campaign of terror. The killer simply vanished from the historical record, leaving behind a trail of devastated families and a community forever changed by fear. What makes the Atlanta Ripper case even more significant is its place in the broader context of American serial killing. This occurred decades before the FBI would develop profiling techniques, or before law enforcement had sophisticated methods for tracking serial offenders. The killer operated in an era when forensic science was primitive, and when the victim's marginalized status meant their deaths were barely investigated. The case also highlights how social prejudice can enable serial killers to operate with impunity. The Atlanta Ripper understood that targeting black women in the Jim Crow South meant his crimes would receive minimal attention from authorities. He exploited systemic racism as effectively as he exploited the dark streets of the Fourth Ward. Today, the Atlanta Ripper case serves as a sobering reminder of how many serial killers have escaped justice throughout American history, particularly when their victims came from marginalized communities. It demonstrates how prejudice and indifference can create the perfect hunting ground for predators, allowing them to operate without fear of serious investigation or consequences. The families of the Atlanta Ripper's victims never received justice, never learned why their loved ones were targeted, and never saw the killer face consequences for his actions. Their stories were largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by more famous cases and more privileged victims. But their lives mattered, their deaths were significant, and their killer remains one of America's most successful and unidentified serial murderers. The Atlanta Ripper case stands as a testament to the victims who were failed by the system that should have protected them, and as a reminder that true crime isn't just about solving puzzles or understanding criminal psychology. The Atlanta Ripper case represents one of America's most disturbing chapters of racially motivated serial violence, yet it remains largely forgotten by history. Between 1909 and 1914, an unidentified killer terrorized Atlanta's black community, systematically hunting and brutally murdering at least 15 African American women. What makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the savage nature of the crimes, but how the killer operated with near complete impunity in a society that barely acknowledged his victims as human beings. The killer's first documented victim was Belle Walker, a 49-year-old cook whose body was discovered on May 28, 1911, just 25 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. Her sister found her after Belle failed to return from work the previous night. Her throat had been slashed so deeply it was nearly severed from her body. The Atlanta Constitution reported the murder under the headline, "Negro Woman Killed, No Clue to Slayer," a dismissive tone that would characterize coverage throughout the killing spree. 4 weeks later, another victim, Addie Watts, was found with her throat slashed in the same brutal manner. The Atlanta Ripper's victim selection revealed a deliberate and calculated pattern that went beyond random violence. Many had received an education and worked as domestic servants in the homes of white employers. Unlike Jack the Ripper, who targeted prostitutes in London's East End, the Atlanta Ripper focused on respectable working-class women who represented the aspirational black middle class of the era. These women were financially stable, educated, and often employed in positions that required them to travel through the city's poorly lit streets during evening hours. The killer's intimate knowledge of Atlanta's African American neighborhoods became evident through the geographical pattern of his crimes. Many of the murders took place in the city's Old Fourth Ward, an area with limited street lighting and inadequate public transportation. The lack of streetcars meant women often had to walk long distances through dark, isolated areas, making them perfect targets for a predator who knew the territory intimately. Bodies were frequently discovered near railroad tracks, suggesting the killer used the railway system to move between hunting grounds or dispose of evidence. The brutality of the Atlanta Ripper's methods was shocking even by the standards of early 20th century violence. The murders were all committed with knives or other sharp objects, but the killer didn't simply kill his victims and leave. He engaged in extensive post-mortem mutilation, ripping and tearing the bodies after death in ways that shocked even experienced investigators. The level of violence was described as animalistic, with some victims having their heads nearly severed from their bodies. One victim, 40-year-old Lena Sharp, was found on July 1st, 1911, with injuries so severe that witnesses described her head as almost completely detached. What made the Atlanta Ripper case even more terrifying was the killer's apparent desire for recognition and his connection to the infamous Jack the Ripper case. At several murder scenes, police discovered notes signed Jack the Ripper, containing various threats and taunts directed at law enforcement. The killer was clearly aware of the London murders and seemed to be modeling his crimes after the Whitechapel killings, adapting the methods to target Atlanta's vulnerable black population. This wasn't a copycat in the traditional sense, but rather someone who understood the psychological impact of the Jack the Ripper legend and sought to create his own reign of terror. The investigation was fundamentally hampered by the racial attitudes and systemic racism of early 20th century Atlanta. The city was still reeling from the devastating 1906 race riots, where white mobs had killed at least 25 and possibly as many as 40 African American men based on false accusations of sexual assault. The Atlanta Police Department, like most Southern law enforcement agencies of the era, gave minimal attention to crimes against black victims. Investigations were perfunctory at best, with little effort made to collect evidence, interview witnesses, or pursue leads that might have led to the killer's identification. The local press contributed to this climate of indifference through their coverage of the murders. While the Jack the Ripper case in London had generated massive media attention and public outcry, the Atlanta murders were relegated to small notices in back pages of newspapers. Headlines were dismissive and dehumanizing, treating the victims as statistics rather than individuals with families and communities who mourned their loss. This lack of media pressure meant there was little public demand for justice, allowing the killer to operate with virtual impunity. The terror experienced by Atlanta's black community during this period cannot be overstated. By July 1911, after 8 consecutive murders, fear had gripped the community so completely that few black women would venture onto the streets after dark. The Baltimore Sun reported that black service workers were refusing to go to work after sunset, and families were keeping their daughters and wives confined to their homes whenever possible. The economic impact was severe, as many of the victims were domestic workers whose absence from their jobs affected entire households. Despite the clear pattern of murders and the community's pleas for protection, law enforcement's response remained inadequate. The police made few arrests and pursued fewer leads. When suspects were occasionally brought in for questioning, they were quickly released without charges. The investigative techniques of the era were primitive, lacking the forensic capabilities that might have helped identify the killer, but even basic police work like canvassing for witnesses or mapping the crime scenes was poorly executed. The psychological profile that emerges from the Atlanta Ripper case suggests a killer who was not only racially motivated, but also deeply familiar with his victims' routines and neighborhoods. The precision of his attacks and his ability to escape detection indicates someone who lived or worked in the areas where the murders occurred. Some investigators theorize that the killer might have been a white man who employed black domestic workers, giving him intimate knowledge of their schedules and routes home from work. The case took on international dimensions when similarities were noted between the Atlanta murders and crimes occurring in other parts of the world. The methodical nature of the killings, the post-mortem mutilation, and the targeting of vulnerable women bore resemblances to murders occurring in other cities during the same time period. However, without modern communication systems or forensic techniques, these potential connections were never properly investigated. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Atlanta Ripper case is how close investigators may have come to identifying the killer. There were several promising leads that were never fully pursued. One witness reported seeing a well-dressed white man near the scene of one murder, but this information was never followed up. Another report described a man who had been seen talking to one of the victims shortly before her death. But again, no serious investigation was conducted. The end of the Atlanta Ripper's killing spree came as suddenly and mysteriously as it had begun. After 1914, no more murders matching his distinctive pattern were discovered in Atlanta. Whether the killer died, moved away, was imprisoned for other crimes, or simply stopped killing remains unknown. Some historians speculate that he may have been among the many men who enlisted to fight in World War I, but this theory has never been substantiated. The legacy of the Atlanta Ripper case extends far beyond the individual murders. It represents a dark chapter in American history where systemic racism enabled a serial killer to operate with virtual impunity. The case demonstrates how social prejudice can create perfect conditions for predators to flourish, targeting populations that society deems expendable or unworthy of protection. The killer understood that his choice of victims made detection and prosecution unlikely, and he exploited this social blind spot to devastating effect. Modern criminologists who have studied the Atlanta Ripper case believe that with today's investigative techniques and social attitudes, the killer would likely have been caught within months rather than being allowed to operate for years. DNA evidence, improved forensic analysis, better communication between law enforcement agencies, and most importantly, equal treatment of all victims, regardless of race, would have dramatically changed the outcome of the investigation. The families of the Atlanta Ripper's victims never received justice or closure. The women who died were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were cut short by a predator who faced no consequences for his actions. Their stories were largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by more famous cases, and buried beneath decades of systemic indifference to Black suffering. Today, their names are remembered primarily in academic studies and true crime histories, serving as reminders of how societal failures can enable the worst kinds of human evil. The Atlanta Ripper case serves as a stark reminder that some of history's most prolific killers remain unknown, not because they were particularly clever or skilled, but because society failed to value their victims enough to pursue justice. The case of Paul John Knowles reveals how personal rejection can unleash catastrophic violence. When his prison pen pal, Angela Kovich, called off their wedding in 1974, describing an aura of fear that terrified her, something snapped inside Knowles. That same night in San Francisco, he claimed to have murdered 3 people, though this was never verified. Knowles was unlike other serial killers in almost every way. Where most predators follow patterns, he killed randomly. Where others try to avoid detection, he craved fame and notoriety. He wanted books written about him, movies made, with proceeds split with his mother. This narcissistic hunger for recognition made him especially dangerous, because he wasn't just killing to satisfy psychological urges, he was building what he saw as his legacy. The randomness of his victims made him nearly impossible to track. Of the 20 people found dead during his spree, 14 were women and 6 were men. 3 were children, 3 were elderly. Some were shot, others strangled, some were killed during burglaries, others seemed murdered as an afterthought while camping or walking down the street. Some corpses showed evidence of sexual assault, others didn't. The victims were scattered across at least 6 different states, making it impossible for police to establish any kind of perimeter or predict where he might strike next. Barbara Maybe Abel's encounter with Knowles provides chilling insight into his psychological manipulation tactics. When he broke into her home in November 1974, he had already assaulted her sister Beverly. Abel convinced him to take her instead of her son, then spent the next day pretending to be in love with him, telling him he looked like Robert Redford, offering to help tell his story because of her background as a radio copywriter. Her professional skills literally saved her life because Knowles wanted someone to document his crimes for posterity. Even after he raped her and left her tied up in a motel room, his final words to her were, "I love you," demonstrating the twisted psychology of a man who confused violence with intimacy and fame with love. The specific crimes attributed to Knowles show his escalating brutality and complete disregard for human life. In Jacksonville, he gagged 65-year-old Alice Curtis so tightly that she choked to death, then stole her car. He strangled 49-year-old Marjorie Howie and stole her television. When he forced his way into Kathy Sue Pierce's home in Georgia, he strangled the 24-year-old mother but left her 3-year-old son physically unharmed. The murder scene at the Carr family home was described by investigators as looking as if it had been attacked by an animal, with mirrors smashed and blood everywhere, while Knowles calmly wore his victim's clothes to an Atlanta bar where he flirted with a female reporter. His capture came through a combination of law enforcement persistence and civilian heroism. After murdering 2 more victims, Knowles led police on a dramatic car chase through Henry County, Georgia, crashing through a roadblock and injuring Officer Jerry Key when his stolen car slammed into the patrol vehicle. A chaotic foot chase followed, with Knowles pursued by dogs, helicopters, and officers from multiple agencies. He was finally cornered by David Clark, a 27-year-old Vietnam War veteran who happened to be hunting in the area. Clark held Knowles at gunpoint with his shotgun until investigators arrived, later recalling how the serial killer told him he was scared of being killed by police. The final chapter of Knowles's story ended exactly as his life had been lived, in violence and chaos. While being transported to a crime scene the following month, he used a paperclip to open his handcuffs and lunged for Sheriff Earl Lee's gun. GBI agent Ronnie Angel shot him 3 times in the chest. Angel would later describe Knowles simply as evil, and indeed, that seemed to be the only adequate description for a man who had turned murder into performance art, who had killed at least 18 people, not for money or passion or even twisted sexual gratification, but simply because he wanted to be remembered. The audio-taped confessions that might have provided insight into his psychology were destroyed after being ruined beyond repair in a flood of the federal courthouse in Macon, according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Perhaps that's fitting for a man whose entire existence seemed dedicated to chaos and destruction. Paul John Knowles got his wish for fame, but not in the way he intended. Rather than being remembered as a criminal mastermind, he's recalled as a cautionary tale about what happens when narcissism, rejection, and violence combine in a single individual who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The Casanova killer represents a particularly modern type of criminal, one who understood that in an age of mass media, infamy could be a form of immortality. His case reminds us that behind the charming facade and Hollywood good looks can lurk something far more dangerous than the monsters we expect to look monstrous. Now let's examine David Carpenter, known as the Trailside Killer, whose reign of terror in the San Francisco Bay Area during the late 1970s and early 1980s turned peaceful hiking trails into hunting grounds for one of California's most methodical predators. David Joseph Carpenter was born on May 6, 1930, in San Francisco, California. From his earliest years, Carpenter exhibited disturbing behavioral patterns that would later escalate into deadly violence. As a child, he suffered from a severe stutter that made him the target of relentless bullying and social isolation. This speech impediment would become a defining characteristic that shaped his interactions with others and contributed to his growing resentment toward society. The psychological profile of Carpenter reveals a man whose early experiences with rejection and humiliation created a deep-seated need for control and dominance. His stutter made normal social interactions difficult, leading to intense feelings of inadequacy and rage. Teachers and classmates often mocked his speech patterns, creating a cycle of shame and anger that would manifest in increasingly violent fantasies. Unlike many serial killers who show early signs of animal cruelty, Carpenter's early warning signs were more subtle but equally disturbing. He became obsessed with firearms and developed an unhealthy fascination with controlling others through intimidation. Carpenter's criminal career began in his 20s with a series of sexual assaults that demonstrated his preference for attacking women in isolated locations. In 1960, he was convicted of molesting a 7-year-old girl and sentenced to 14 years in prison. This early conviction established a pattern of targeting vulnerable victims who couldn't easily defend themselves or escape. During his incarceration, Carpenter didn't receive meaningful rehabilitation. Instead, his resentment festered and his violent fantasies became more elaborate and detailed. Upon his release in 1970, Carpenter appeared to be attempting to reintegrate into society. He found work as a printer and even got married, presenting a facade of normalcy that masked his continuing violent impulses. However, this period of apparent stability was merely a calm before the storm. Behind his quiet demeanor, Carpenter was planning and fantasizing about the perfect crimes, attacks that would give him complete control over his victims while minimizing his chances of being caught. The transformation from career criminal to serial killer occurred when Carpenter discovered the perfect hunting ground, the hiking trails and state parks around the San Francisco Bay Area. These locations offered everything he needed: isolated victims, multiple escape routes, and terrain that he could study and memorize in advance. The trails attracted exactly the type of victims Carpenter preferred: young women and couples who were alone and vulnerable, far from help when he struck. Carpenter's methodology was terrifyingly systematic. He would spend weeks or even months scouting potential attack locations, learning every trail, every hiding spot, every possible escape route. He carried detailed maps and kept meticulous notes about park schedules, ranger patrols, and visitor patterns. This level of preparation made him extraordinarily difficult to catch, as he always seemed to be one step ahead of law enforcement. The first confirmed trailside killer attack occurred on August 19, 1979, when Etta Kane and her boyfriend were hiking on Mount Tamalpais. Carpenter approached them with a gun, forced them off the main trail, and shot both victims. Kane survived the attack despite being shot in the neck, providing investigators with their first detailed description of the killer. Her testimony revealed crucial details about Carpenter's speech impediment and his methodical approach to the attack. The psychological aspects of Carpenter's crimes reveal a killer driven by a need to demonstrate power and control. Unlike killers motivated primarily by sexual gratification, Carpenter seemed to derive satisfaction from the complete terror he instilled in his victims. He often forced victims to walk long distances before attacking them, prolonging their fear and his sense of dominance. This sadistic element distinguished him from other serial killers and made his crimes particularly heinous. The case of Heather Skaggs provides insight into Carpenter's escalating violence and his ability to adapt his methods. On March 8, 1980, 19-year-old Skaggs was hiking alone on Mount Tamalpais when she encountered Carpenter. Unlike his previous attacks on couples, this represented an evolution in his targeting. He was becoming bolder and more confident in his ability to control single victims. Skaggs's body was found the next day, and the evidence suggested she had been forced to endure a prolonged ordeal before being killed. The investigation into the trailside killer attacks was hampered by the remote locations of the crimes and Carpenter's careful preparation. He chose attack sites that were far from roads and difficult for investigators to process thoroughly. The scattered nature of the crime scenes across multiple jurisdictions also complicated the investigation, as different agencies initially worked the cases separately before recognizing the connections. Ann Alderson's murder on October 15, 1980, marked another escalation in Carpenter's violence. The 26-year-old was found shot to death on Mount Tamalpais, and the crime scene evidence suggested that Carpenter was becoming more confident and taking greater risks. The increasing frequency of attacks indicated that he was losing whatever restraint had previously controlled his impulses. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of witness testimony and forensic evidence. Carpenter's distinctive stutter, reported by surviving victims, became a crucial identifying characteristic. When investigators began connecting attacks across different jurisdictions, the speech impediment emerged as a consistent element that helped establish the pattern. This detail, combined with ballistics evidence linking multiple crime scenes, allowed investigators to build a comprehensive profile of the killer. Carpenter's capture on May 14, 1981, occurred not through brilliant detective work, but through a routine traffic stop that revealed his connection to the crimes. When arrested, he was found in possession of firearms that ballistics testing would later link to multiple trailside killer attacks. His methodical nature, which had made him so difficult to catch, ultimately worked against him, as the physical evidence he had accumulated provided an undeniable link to the crimes. The trial of David Carpenter became a media sensation, with surviving victims providing harrowing testimony about their encounters with the trailside killer. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence linking Carpenter to at least 7 murders and numerous attempted murders. The defense attempted to portray him as mentally ill, but the careful planning and methodical nature of his crimes undermined any insanity defense. Carpenter was ultimately convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. However, like many death row inmates in California, he would spend decades appealing his sentence while the legal system processed his case. The lengthy appeals process meant that Carpenter remained alive long after his victims had been forgotten by all but their families and the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. The impact of the Trailside Killer case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Carpenter's crimes fundamentally changed how people viewed outdoor recreation in the Bay Area. Popular hiking trails that had once been considered safe became associated with terror and death. Park attendance dropped dramatically, and those who continued to hike adopted new safety precautions that reflected the reality that even nature's most peaceful settings could harbor deadly predators. David Carpenter died on death row on May 1st, 2021, having spent 4 decades in prison for his crimes. His death came not from execution, but from natural causes, denying the families of his victims the closure that his execution might have provided. The fact that he lived for so many years after destroying so many lives serves as a reminder of how the legal system sometimes fails to provide swift justice for the most heinous crimes. The legacy of the Trailside Killer case lies not just in the lives lost, but in the lessons learned about how serial predators adapt and evolve their methods. Carpenter's systematic approach to selecting victims and crime scenes demonstrated a level of planning and intelligence that challenged investigators' assumptions about how serial killers operate. The Atlanta Ripper case reveals how systemic racism and social prejudice allowed a serial killer to operate with virtual impunity in the early 20th century South. Unlike the more famous Jack the Ripper, who terrorized London's Whitechapel district, the Atlanta Ripper's crimes were largely ignored by authorities and the press because his victims were African American women in a city still reeling from the violent race riots of 1906. The killer's first documented victim was Belle Walker, a cook whose body was found on May 28, 1911, with her throat slashed near her home on Garibaldi Street. This would set the tone for how the subsequent murders would be treated by both law enforcement and the media. 4 weeks later, Addie Watts was discovered with similar wounds, establishing a pattern that would continue for years. The Atlanta Ripper demonstrated a clear victim preference that reflected both his psychological pathology and the social dynamics of the era. Many had received some education and worked as domestic servants in white households. This targeting of educated working women of color suggests the killer may have been motivated by racial hatred combined with resentment toward African Americans who had achieved some measure of respectability despite the oppressive Jim Crow system. The killer's methodology was brutally consistent. Victims were attacked with knives or other sharp instruments, their throats slashed with such violence that some, like 40-year-old Lena Sharp, were nearly decapitated. After death, the Ripper would mutilate and tear at the bodies in a frenzy of violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. This post-mortem mutilation suggests a level of rage and hatred that went beyond mere murder into the realm of symbolic destruction. The geographical pattern of the crimes reveals intimate knowledge of Atlanta's African American neighborhoods. Many killings occurred in the Old Fourth Ward, an area with limited street lighting and poor public transportation that provided the killer with cover of darkness. Bodies were frequently discovered near railroad tracks, suggesting the killer may have used the rail system to move between hunting grounds or dispose of evidence. The fact that several attacks occurred near the homes of white employers where victims worked indicates the killer was familiar with their routines and movements. What made the Atlanta Ripper particularly dangerous was not just his violence, but the social context that allowed him to kill with impunity. The Atlanta of 1911 was a city desperately trying to rebrand itself as part of the New South movement, seeking Northern investment while maintaining its racial hierarchy. City leaders wanted to project an image of progress and stability, making a series of brutal murders an unwelcome reminder of the region's violent racial tensions. The 1906 Atlanta race riots had already damaged the city's reputation, resulting in the deaths of at least 25 African Americans at the hands of white mobs following false accusations of rape. This desire to maintain Atlanta's image meant that crimes against African American victims received minimal attention from police and virtually no coverage in the white press. The investigation was hampered not just by the racial attitudes of the era, but by deliberate institutional neglect. Detective work that might have been routine for white victims was simply not performed for black victims. Evidence was not carefully collected, witnesses were not thoroughly interviewed, and patterns were not systematically analyzed. The terror within Atlanta's African American community was palpable and well documented. By July 1911, after the eighth consecutive killing, the Baltimore Sun reported that black women were refusing to venture out after dark, and domestic workers were declining to work evening hours. The community was essentially under siege, but their fear was not reflected in the broader city's response. White Atlanta continued its daily routines, largely unaware of the systematic slaughter occurring in the black neighborhoods. The case generated its first eyewitness account with the murder of Lena Sharp on July 1st, 1911. This killing provided investigators with their best opportunity to identify the perpetrator, but the lead was not aggressively pursued. The investigation's limitations became even more apparent when similar notes signed Jack the Ripper began appearing at crime scenes, complete with threats and taunts directed at police. These communications should have provided valuable evidence about the killer's psychology and possibly his handwriting, but they failed to generate significant investigative momentum. The Atlanta Ripper's reign of terror officially ended in 1914, though whether this was due to the killer's death, departure from the city, or incarceration for other crimes remains unknown. No arrest was ever made, no suspect was ever publicly identified, and no definitive closure was ever provided to the families of the victims. The case simply faded from public attention as Atlanta moved on to other concerns, leaving behind only the memory of 15 murdered women whose lives were deemed unworthy of justice. The legacy of the Atlanta Ripper case extends far beyond the individual crimes. It represents a dark chapter in American criminal justice history, demonstrating how social prejudice can create conditions where serial killers can operate with virtual immunity. The case also highlights the vulnerability of marginalized communities to predatory violence and the tragic consequences when law enforcement fails to protect all citizens equally. Modern criminologists studying the case have noted striking similarities to other unsolved serial murders of the era, suggesting the possibility that the Atlanta Ripper may have been active in other cities as well. The lack of thorough investigation and documentation from the original crimes makes it impossible to definitively link the Atlanta murders to other cases. But the pattern of targeting educated African American women was not unique to Atlanta during this period. The Atlanta Ripper case serves as a sobering reminder that some of history's most prolific serial killers may have escaped justice not because of their cunning or skill, but because their victims belonged to communities that society deemed expendable. In an era when African American lives were systematically devalued, a killer could murder 15 women and disappear into history without consequence. His crimes remembered only as a footnote in the broader story of American racial violence. This case underscores the importance of equal justice under law and the dangers inherent when certain populations are denied the full protection of law enforcement. Our final killer in this chilling collection is David Carpenter, known as the Trailside Killer, who terrorized hikers and nature lovers across Northern California's scenic trails during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Unlike the other predators we've examined, Carpenter chose some of the most beautiful and seemingly safe locations in America as his hunting grounds, forever changing how people viewed the simple pleasure of a peaceful hike in nature. David Joseph Carpenter was born on May 6, 1930, in San Francisco, California. From the very beginning, his life was marked by struggles that would later be cited as contributing factors to his violent tendencies. Carpenter suffered from a severe stuttering problem that made communication extremely difficult and became a source of constant humiliation throughout his childhood and adolescence. This speech impediment isolated him from his peers and created deep-seated resentment that would fester for decades. The psychological impact of his stuttering cannot be understated. In school, Carpenter was relentlessly mocked and bullied by classmates who mimicked his speech patterns and excluded him from social activities. Teachers often grew impatient with his attempts to speak, further reinforcing his sense of inadequacy and rage. This constant humiliation created a perfect storm of anger, sexual frustration, and desire for revenge that would eventually manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. As a young man, Carpenter's inability to form normal relationships with women became another source of torment. His stuttering made dating nearly impossible, and the few romantic encounters he attempted ended in rejection and further humiliation. This sexual frustration, combined with his existing anger issues, began to take on darker undertones as he entered his 20s and 30s. Carpenter's first brush with serious criminal behavior came in the 1960s when he was arrested for child molestation. The details of these early crimes revealed a man whose sexual impulses had become twisted with violence and control. He served time in prison, where his stuttering made him a target for other inmates, further intensifying his rage against society. Upon his release, rather than seeking help or attempting rehabilitation, Carpenter retreated further into his dark fantasies. The choice of hiking trails as his preferred hunting ground was both strategic and symbolic. The remote nature of these locations provided him with the privacy he needed to carry out his attacks without immediate interference. More importantly, the trails attracted exactly the type of victims that fed his twisted desires: young, attractive women, often hiking alone or in small groups, far from help when danger struck. Carpenter's methodology was as calculated as it was brutal. He would scout popular hiking areas, learning the patterns of regular hikers and identifying the most isolated sections of trails where screams would go unheard. He often posed as a fellow hiker, using his knowledge of the trails to gain the trust of potential victims. His speech impediment, ironically, sometimes worked in his favor, as people felt sorry for him and let their guard down around what appeared to be a harmless, stuttering man. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Trailside Killer occurred in August 1979 when Etta Kane and her friend were hiking on Mount Tamalpais in Marin County. Kane was shot and killed, while her companion was sexually assaulted but survived. The random nature of the attack and the remote location initially led investigators to believe it might have been the work of someone under the influence of drugs or having a psychotic break. The pattern became clearer with subsequent attacks. In March 1980, Barbara Schwartz was found shot to death on the same mountain. 2 months later, Ann Alderson was killed while jogging on Mount Tamalpais. The proximity of these crimes and the similar methodology began to paint a picture of a serial killer who had claimed one of California's most popular recreational areas as his personal hunting ground. What made Carpenter particularly dangerous was his ability to blend in with the hiking community. He wasn't the stereotypical image of a dangerous predator lurking in the shadows. Instead, he appeared to be just another middle-aged man enjoying the outdoors. He carried hiking gear, knew the trail systems, and could discuss local flora and fauna with apparent enthusiasm. This camouflage allowed him to get close to victims who might otherwise have been more cautious. The investigation into the Trailside Killer murders was complicated by the vast area he covered and the jurisdictional issues that arose when crimes occurred across multiple counties. Different law enforcement agencies were initially working separate cases, not realizing they were dealing with a single perpetrator. The remote locations also meant that physical evidence was often compromised by weather and wildlife before it could be properly collected. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of witness testimony and ballistics evidence. Survivors of attacks were able to provide descriptions of the perpetrator, and spent shell casings found at multiple crime scenes were matched through forensic analysis. The investigation focused on men with criminal records who had access to the trail systems and fit the physical description provided by witnesses. Carpenter's capture came in May 1981 when he was arrested in connection with the murder of Heather Skaggs in Big Sur. The arrest was the result of painstaking detective work that connected him to multiple crime scenes through physical evidence and witness testimony. When investigators searched his residence, they found hiking equipment, maps of various trail systems, and most damning of all, the murder weapon used in several of the attacks. During questioning, Carpenter's stuttering became more pronounced under stress, but he remained largely uncooperative with investigators. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed more concerned with the legal consequences he faced than with the lives he had destroyed. His demeanor during interrogation was described as cold and calculating, a stark contrast to the bumbling, harmless persona he had cultivated on the trails. The trial of David Carpenter was a media sensation that gripped the San Francisco Bay Area. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded predator who had turned some of California's most beautiful natural areas into scenes of terror and death. The defense attempted to use his stuttering problem and troubled childhood as mitigating factors, arguing that his speech impediment had created the psychological conditions that led to his violent behavior. The evidence against Carpenter was overwhelming. Ballistics tests conclusively linked his gun to multiple murders. Witnesses identified him as being present at several crime scenes around the times of the attacks. Most compelling of all, several survivors of his attacks positively identified him in court, describing in harrowing detail how he had transformed from an apparently harmless hiker into a violent predator. Carpenter was ultimately convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole when California temporarily abolished the death penalty. He remains incarcerated today, now in his 90s, still showing no remorse for the terror he inflicted on innocent people seeking nothing more than a peaceful connection with nature. The impact of Carpenter's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The trailside killer fundamentally changed how people approached outdoor recreation in Northern California. Hiking groups became more common as people sought safety in numbers. Trail usage patterns shifted as popular routes became associated with danger rather than peaceful recreation. The psychological impact on the hiking community was profound and long-lasting. What makes the case of David Carpenter particularly disturbing is how he perverted something as innocent and healthy as hiking into an opportunity for violence and murder. Unlike killers who stalked urban areas or frequented the criminal underworld, Carpenter chose to hunt in places where people went to find peace, exercise, and spiritual connection with nature. He turned sanctuaries into crime scenes and forever changed how his victims' families and friends viewed the natural world. The story of the trailside killer serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades and strike in the places we least expect. Carpenter's crimes demonstrate how personal inadequacies and psychological damage, when left untreated, can metastasize into something monstrous that destroys not just individual lives, but entire communities' sense of safety and peace. These 5 cases, Carl Eugene Watts, the New Bedford Highway Killer, Paul John Knowles, the Atlanta Ripper, and David Carpenter, represent some of the most disturbing examples of serial murder in American history. What makes them particularly chilling is not just the brutality of their crimes, but how they manage to operate largely undetected or unpunished for extended periods. Our final killer from this dark collection brings us to the hills and trails of Northern California, where what should have been peaceful nature walks became scenes of unimaginable terror. David Joseph Carpenter, known as the Trailside Killer, represents perhaps the most calculated and methodical predator we've examined today. Unlike the chaotic randomness of some serial killers, Carpenter demonstrated a chilling level of planning and preparation that made him extraordinarily dangerous to anyone who crossed his path on the hiking trails he claimed as his hunting ground. Born on May 6, 1930, in San Francisco, David Carpenter's early life was marked by the kind of profound humiliation and rejection that would later manifest in his violent crimes against women. From childhood, Carpenter suffered from a severe stuttering problem that made him the target of relentless bullying and social ostracism. This speech impediment wasn't just an inconvenience, it became the defining characteristic that shaped his entire worldview and his relationship with other people, particularly women. The constant mockery and rejection he faced created a deep-seated rage that would simmer beneath the surface for decades before exploding into violence. The transformation of Carpenter from a socially awkward outcast to a dangerous predator didn't happen overnight. Throughout his 20s and 30s, he accumulated a disturbing criminal record that included burglary, assault, and most significantly, sexual offenses. In 1960, he was convicted of child molestation and sentenced to prison, where he would spend the next 7 years. Rather than serving as rehabilitation, his time behind bars only seemed to intensify his hatred toward society, and particularly toward women, whom he blamed for his rejection and humiliation. When he was released in 1967, Carpenter emerged as a man consumed by fantasies of revenge and control. What made Carpenter particularly dangerous was his methodical approach to selecting both his victims and his crime scenes. Unlike killers who operated in urban environments or targeted specific demographics, Carpenter chose to hunt in the remote hiking trails and parks of Northern California. This wasn't a random choice, but a calculated decision that offered him several tactical advantages. The isolated nature of hiking trails meant that his victims would be alone and vulnerable, far from help when he struck. The remote locations also made it difficult for law enforcement to respond quickly and provided him with multiple escape routes through terrain he had carefully studied and prepared. Carpenter's victim selection revealed his deep-seated misogyny and need for control over those he perceived as embodying the rejection he had faced throughout his life. He primarily targeted young women who were hiking alone or in small groups, often choosing victims who appeared confident and self-assured. To Carpenter, these women represented everything he felt had been denied to him in life, and attacking them became his way of asserting the power and control he had never possessed in normal social interactions. His victims were typically in their 20s and 30s, often professionals or students who used the trails for recreation and exercise, transforming what should have been safe, healthy activities into deadly encounters. The first confirmed attack attributed to the trailside killer occurred in August 1979 when Etta Kane, a 44-year-old bank employee, was found shot to death on a trail in Mount Tamalpais State Park. Kane had been hiking alone when Carpenter approached her, likely using his practiced routine of appearing harmless before revealing his true intentions. The crime scene revealed the methodical nature of his planning. He had chosen a location that was secluded enough to avoid detection, but accessible enough for him to make a quick escape. The precision of the attack and the lack of physical evidence left behind demonstrated that this wasn't his first violent crime, even if it was his first confirmed murder. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Carpenter's crimes revealed a killer who combined careful planning with explosive violence. Unlike many serial killers who escalate gradually, Carpenter seemed to have developed his methodology through years of fantasy and preparation. He would scout hiking trails extensively, learning the patterns of park rangers and other hikers, identifying the best locations for attacks, and planning multiple escape routes. This level of preparation meant that when he struck, he did so with devastating efficiency, leaving his victims little chance to escape or defend themselves. The attack on Heather Skaggs in March 1980 provided investigators with their first real insight into Carpenter's methods and mindset. Skaggs, a 20-year-old student, was hiking with a friend on Mount Tamalpais when they encountered a man who initially appeared to be just another hiker. Carpenter engaged them in seemingly innocent conversation before suddenly producing a gun and ordering them off the main trail into a more secluded area. The systematic way he controlled the situation, separating the women and using psychological intimidation as much as physical threats, revealed a killer who had refined his approach through careful planning and possibly previous attacks that had gone unreported. What made Carpenter's crimes particularly terrifying was the way he combined sexual violence with murder, creating a pattern of escalating brutality that left investigators struggling to predict his next move. His attacks weren't quick killings, but prolonged ordeals in which he subjected his victims to psychological torture before the final act of violence. He seemed to derive as much satisfaction from the fear and helplessness of his victims as from the ultimate act of murder itself. This psychological component of his crimes made him especially dangerous because it meant he was likely to continue escalating until he was caught. The investigation into the trailside killer was complicated by the remote locations of the crimes and the lack of witnesses in the isolated areas where Carpenter operated. Traditional police work, which relied heavily on witness statements and physical evidence from urban crime scenes, was less effective in the wilderness settings Carpenter had chosen. Investigators had to adapt their methods, working with park rangers and using tracking techniques more commonly associated with search and rescue operations than criminal investigations. The vast area covered by the various parks and trails also meant that multiple jurisdictions were involved, creating coordination challenges that Carpenter seemed to exploit by moving between different areas. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimony that finally connected the various attacks to a single perpetrator. Ballistics evidence from multiple crime scenes showed that the same weapon had been used in several of the murders, establishing a clear link between attacks that had previously been treated as separate incidents. More importantly, survivors of Carpenter's attacks were able to provide detailed descriptions that, despite his attempts to disguise his appearance, included distinctive characteristics that helped investigators narrow their search. The capture of David Carpenter in May 1981 came through old-fashioned police work combined with the kind of lucky break that often plays a crucial role in solving serial cases. Acting on a tip from someone who recognized Carpenter's description and knew about his criminal history, investigators began surveillance of his activities. They discovered that he was making regular trips to the same areas where the trailside killer attacks had occurred, and his behavior pattern matched the careful scouting activities that profilers had predicted the killer would engage in. When they finally arrested him, they found evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes, including personal items taken from victims. The trial of David Carpenter revealed the full extent of his crimes and provided insight into the mind of a killer who had managed to terrorize an entire region for nearly 2 years. The prosecution presented evidence linking him to at least 7 murders and several additional attacks, though investigators suspected the true number of his victims might be higher. Survivors testified about the methodical way he had conducted his attacks, describing how he seemed to follow a predetermined script that maximized both their terror and his control over the situation. The clinical precision with which he had planned and executed his crimes stood in stark contrast to his presentation as a mild-mannered, stuttering man who seemed incapable of such violence. Perhaps most chilling was the revelation that Carpenter had been preparing for his killing spree for years, accumulating weapons, studying maps of hiking trails, and developing the physical fitness necessary to navigate the rugged terrain where he committed his crimes. This wasn't a sudden break from reality, but a long-term project that he had pursued with the same dedication that others might apply to a career or hobby. The level of preparation involved suggested that he viewed murder not as an impulsive act, but as a skill to be perfected through practice and planning. The impact of Carpenter's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect the entire outdoor recreation community in Northern California. Hiking, which had been seen as a safe and healthy activity, suddenly became associated with danger and vulnerability. Park attendance dropped dramatically, and those who continued to use the trails often did so in large groups or with weapons for protection. The psychological impact of knowing that someone was specifically targeting hikers created a climate of fear that persisted long after Carpenter's arrest and conviction. David Carpenter was ultimately convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He remains on death row in California, where he has spent more than 4 decades fighting his sentence through various appeals. The length of time between his conviction and execution has allowed him to become one of the longest-serving inmates on California's death row, a status that has generated ongoing debate about the effectiveness and morality of capital punishment in cases of serial murder. The Trailside Killer case also highlighted important issues about public safety in recreational areas and the challenges faced by law enforcement in protecting people who engage in outdoor activities in remote locations. The crimes led to increased security measures in many parks, including more frequent ranger patrols, improved communication systems for hikers, and educational programs about personal safety in wilderness settings. These changes represented a recognition that the traditional approach to park management, which emphasized preserving the natural experience while minimizing human interference, needed to be balanced against the reality that predators like Carpenter could exploit the isolation and vulnerability that made parks attractive to visitors. The 5 killers we've examined today represent different facets of the serial murder phenomenon, but they share common characteristics that make them particularly dangerous and difficult to catch. Carl Eugene Watts operated through apparent randomness that masked a deeper psychological compulsion. The New Bedford highway killer exploited societal vulnerabilities and prejudices that made his victims easy targets. Paul John Knowles combined charisma with ruthless violence in his quest for notoriety. The Atlanta Ripper took advantage of racial tensions and police indifference to operate with impunity. And David Carpenter used careful planning and preparation to transform peaceful recreational areas into hunting grounds. What unites these cases is not just the horror of the crimes themselves, but the way they reveal the gaps and blind spots in our society that allow such predators to operate. Whether it's the tendency to dismiss crimes against marginalized populations, the failure to recognize patterns that cross jurisdictional boundaries, or the assumption that certain places or activities are inherently safe, these cases show how killers exploit our assumptions and prejudices to continue their violence. The legacy of these lesser-known serial killers serves as a reminder that evil often operates in the shadows, away from the media spotlight that follows more famous cases. While names like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer have become part of popular culture, the killers we've discussed today were equally dangerous and in some cases more prolific than their famous counterparts. Their relative obscurity doesn't diminish the impact they had on their communities or the importance of understanding their methods and motivations. Perhaps most importantly, these cases demonstrate the resilience of the communities that survived these killers and the dedication of the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring them to justice. Despite the challenges posed by limited resources, jurisdictional boundaries, and societal indifference, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and community members refused to give up on the victims or accept that these crimes would go unsolved. Their persistence ultimately led to the capture and conviction of these killers, providing some measure of justice for the victims and closure for their families. The study of these cases also contributes to our broader understanding of serial murder and the factors that create and enable such killers. By examining the backgrounds, methods, and motivations of these predators, researchers and law enforcement professionals can develop better strategies for prevention, investigation, and prosecution of similar crimes. The patterns revealed in these cases have informed the development of criminal profiling techniques, victim protection programs, and interagency cooperation protocols that continue to evolve as our understanding of serial murder deepens. As we conclude this examination of some of America's most evil but forgotten serial killers, it's important to remember that behind every case file and crime statistic were real people whose lives were cut short by these predators. The victims of Carl Eugene Watts, the New Bedford highway killer, Paul John Knowles, the Atlanta Ripper, and David Carpenter were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends whose absence left permanent holes in the lives of those who loved them. While we study these cases to understand and prevent similar crimes, we must never lose sight of the human cost of the violence these killers inflicted. The darkness these men brought into the world serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within humanity. But it also highlights the importance of the systems and institutions we've built to protect the innocent and bring criminals to justice. Though these killers may be largely forgotten by popular culture, their crimes continue to inform and improve our ongoing efforts to create a safer society for everyone. In remembering their victims and studying their methods, we honor both the dead and the living by working to ensure that such predators cannot operate with impunity in our communities.